The night they carried King Varen through the gates, Isla thought he was already dead. She was crouched behind a stone column in the lower corridor, hiding, which was what she did best, when the soldiers came through. 6 of them. Enormous men with blood on their armor and terror in their eyes, and that was how Isla knew it was serious. Men like that did not show terror. She pressed herself smaller against the cold stone and watched them pass. The king's body hung between them like something broken. His chest plate had been split clean through on the left side. The wound beneath it, she could see it even in the torchlight, even from where she knelt, was deep, ragged. The kind of wound that didn't leave you time to make peace with anyone. Isla had been a healer's ward since she was 9 years old. She knew what dying looked like. She also knew she was the last person in this fortress who should be anywhere near the Alpha King. Wolfless, they called her, not always to her face, but always loud enough to hear. The pack had 43 members and Isla ranked below every single one of them, including the pups who hadn't even shifted their first time yet. She had no wolf, no rank, no place at any table that mattered. She was tolerated the way a draft is tolerated, noticed only when it made something uncomfortable. The only reason she still slept inside the fortress walls was Maris, the old head healer, who had taken her in when no one else would, and taught her everything she knew about roots and stitching, and the specific mercy of keeping someone alive when they'd rather just be done with it. Maris, who was currently 3 days' ride away at the border settlement, tending to a fever outbreak. Isla stayed crouched behind the column until the soldiers passed. Then she did what she always did. She stayed out of the way. Except she could still hear him breathing from down the hall. Labored, wet, wrong. She told herself it wasn't her problem. She told herself there were others. She told herself the king had his own people, his own healers, his own everything. He did not need some wolfless Omega creeping in from the shadows with her second-hand knowledge and her hands that shook when she was nervous. She made it almost all the way back to her room before she turned around. The healer's chamber off the great hall was chaos when she arrived. 2 soldiers stood in the doorway looking useless. A third was shouting for Pembroke, the secondary healer, who apparently couldn't be found. The king was laid out on the stone table in the center of the room, and no one was doing anything about the wound. Isla slipped in under the arm of one of the soldiers before he noticed her. The wound was worse up close. Something had driven through the armor, a blade, she thought, or maybe a lance from the angle of it, and the edges of the torn flesh were already darkening in a way that made her stomach drop. Not just blood loss. Corruption beginning. She'd seen it happen fast in men who'd taken iron in battle. She reached for the supply rack without thinking. Cloth. The dark solution Maris used for cleaning. Needle already threaded. Maris always kept 3-threaded and ready, a habit Isla had picked up for realizing. What is that Omega doing? The voice came from behind her, hard, clipped. One of the soldiers. Isla didn't answer. She pressed clean cloth to the wound and the king made a sound, low and broken, and she felt something move through her that she didn't have a name for. Not a wolf. She didn't have a wolf, but something. Get her out of here, someone else said. She is the only one here who knows what she's doing, said a third voice, and Isla looked up long enough to see one of the older guards, grey at the temples, a scar across his jaw, standing with his arms crossed against the far wall. He was watching her hands, not her face. Let her work. There was silence after that, the kind that meant people were deciding things, and then there was just the sound of Isla working. She ran into the problem 40 minutes in. The wound was clean. She'd gotten the corruption before it could take hold. Barely, but she'd gotten it. The bleeding had slowed. But the deepest part of the tear, the part that went in at an angle toward the ribs, needed to be closed with something that would hold. The regular thread kept slipping. The flesh there was too stressed, too close to movement with every breath he took. She reached for the surgical cord. It was gone. The cabinet where Maris kept the reserve supplies had been emptied out, stripped probably by whoever had raided the supplies during the chaos of the king's arrival. Isla sat back on her heels and looked at the wound and breathed. She had one option. She'd read about it once, in an old text from the Eastern Pax, a technique used in the field when nothing else was available. Maris had mentioned it once, and then never again, the way she mentioned things she considered too extreme to actually use. A healer's own hair, specifically hair from the nape of the neck, where the strands were strongest, could be used as surgical thread in an emergency. The old texts said something about a bond of life passing between healer and patient when it was used. Isla had assumed that was poetry. She pulled the small blade from the supply kit and cut a careful length from just below the knot of hair at the back of her neck. The king's eyes opened while she was halfway through the third stitch. Gold, she realized distantly, the way you notice things when you're trying not to panic. His eyes were gold, not amber, not brown. True gold, the color of old coins held up to light. He looked at her and said nothing. Isla said nothing either. She kept her eyes on the wound and kept her hands steady and finished the stitch. "What thread is this?" he said. His voice was low and rough from whatever he'd been breathing out on the battlefield, and it wasn't a question exactly, more like an observation made out loud. "Hair," Isla said. "Whose?" "Mine." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "What is your name?" She tied off the last stitch before she answered. "Isla. Isla," he repeated, like he was storing it somewhere. She stood up and set the needle down on the cloth and checked her work one more time. Clean, closed. It would hold if he didn't move too much for the next 3 days. "You'll need to keep still," she told him. "No shifting. No, you're not Pack." She met his eyes then, because there was nothing in his voice she could identify. Not contempt, not anger, just the statement, level and direct, like he was noting the color of the walls. "No?" she agreed. "But you stayed." She didn't have an answer for that, so she cleaned the instruments instead, and when she turned back around, his eyes were closed again. She couldn't tell if he was sleeping or just done talking. She told herself it didn't matter. She told herself she would walk out and go back to her room, and tomorrow everything would be the same as it had always been. She was almost in the doorway when the old guard with the scar, Dunmar. She remembered his name now. He'd been with the king's force for 20 years, said quietly, "You should go before the others come back." She nodded and went. She was summoned before the Beta Council at dawn. Isla had expected this. It didn't make the long walk down the corridor feel any less like walking into a cage. The room was cold. The 5 wolves who sat at the long table were colder. She knew 2 of them by face and none of them by name, which told her everything about her standing in this fortress. The one in the center, big, broad, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same stone as the walls, set his palms flat on the table and looked at her the way people looked at problems they were still figuring out how to get rid of. "You entered the king's chamber without permission." "There was no one else," Isla said. "You touched the king. He would have died. You used." The man paused, and something moved across his face that she couldn't read. An irregular technique on the king. Isla folded her hands in front of her and said nothing. "Where did you learn it?" "From the old healer's texts. Maris has copies in the archive." "And you thought it appropriate to use an untested method on the Alpha King?" "It wasn't untested," Isla said. "It worked." The room was very quiet after that. The man in the center, she would learn later that his name was Travar, that he had been the king's beta for 11 years, studied her for a long moment. Then he said, "You'll remain in the fortress until the king has recovered. You'll be available if the wound requires further attention." It was not, she noticed, a thank you. It was also not a dismissal, not in the way she'd expected, not a hand waved toward the door and her own life resuming exactly as it had before. She walked back to her room and sat on the edge of her bed and stared at the wall and tried to figure out why her hands were still shaking. 3 days passed. She didn't see the king. She didn't expect to. She tended to her small work. The infirmary had a boy with a broken wrist and an older woman recovering from a lung infection, and she stayed out of the way, and she told herself she was not listening for anything from the direction of the king's chamber. On the fourth day, Dunmar came to find her. "He's asking for you," was all he said. The king was sitting up when she arrived. The wound was healing. She checked it carefully, turned his face away when he tried to watch her hands, the way she'd always done with patients who made her nervous. And when she finished, she stepped back and told him it looked clean. "Sit down," he said. "I should." "Sit down, Isla." She sat. He looked at her the way he had on the table, directly, without the particular cruelty she'd grown accustomed to from wolves who outranked her, but also without the careful neutrality people used when they were managing something. Just looking. "Dunmar told me you almost didn't come in," Varen said. "That you were in the corridor and you turned around twice before you stayed." Isla opened her mouth and closed it again. She hadn't known anyone saw that. "Why did you stay?" She thought about lying. She thought about saying something practical, something about her training, something that would make sense. "I could hear you breathing," she said instead. It sounded wrong. He was quiet for a moment. Most healers in this fortress would have waited for someone with the right rank to make the call. Most healers had somewhere else to be. She paused. "I didn't." Something shifted in his expression that she couldn't name. "You said you're not Pack." "I'm not, but you've been here 3 years." He was looking at her hands now the way Dunmar had looked at her hands in the healer's chamber, like they were the most trustworthy part of her. "And in 3 years, no Pack has claimed you." It wasn't a question, but it had the shape of one. Isla looked at the window instead of his face. "No. Is that by choice?" "No." She didn't mean to say it that clearly. The word came out before she could sand the edges off it, and she sat with it in the air between them and waited for him to do something with it. He didn't press her. He just nodded, once like he was logging the information. "I want to know about the thread," he said. She explained it to him the way she'd have explained it to Maris. Clinically, the mechanics of it, why regular cord had failed and why the technique had worked, and why she'd been cautious to cut from the nape rather than elsewhere. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "The old texts describe an effect beyond the physical." Isla felt something move through her chest. "I thought that was metaphor." "It may not be." She met his eyes then, and she felt it, not dramatically, not the way the stories described, not like lightning or certainty, more like hearing a sound in a quiet room and realizing the quiet hadn't been empty, it had been waiting. "I don't have a wolf," she said. The words came out flat and firm, the way she'd learned to say things that hurt before someone else said them. "I know," Varen said, "and yet." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. They both sat in the shape of what he hadn't said, and Isla's hands, resting in her lap, felt very far away from her. On the 6th day, Cassian arrived. He was Varen's cousin, she learned. The same height, broader through the shoulders, and the kind of good-looking that knew itself and used it. He came in from the eastern road with 12 riders and a story about a threat at the northern border that needed the king's attention immediately. Isla watched him from the upper corridor as he crossed the courtyard below, and something about the way he moved made her still. She'd grown up learning to read rooms. You did when you had no rank. You learned to see the things that wolves with status never bothered to track. Who looked at whom, who moved when someone else moved, who smiled with their mouth and not their eyes. Cassian smiled at everyone. His eyes didn't move with his smile at all. He went to see the king that afternoon. She wasn't in the room, but she was in the adjoining corridor, technically checking on a supply cabinet, technically not listening, and she could hear the shape of the conversation if not the words. Cassian's voice, smooth and warm. Varen's, slower, more careful, something being negotiated. When Cassian left, Travar came to find her, Kunst. "The Lord Cassian wishes to know about the technique used on the king," he said. Isla turned to look at him. "Why?" Travar's face did something complicated. "He has questions about the Eastern Pact texts." "The texts are in the archive," Isla said. "Anyone can access them. He's asking specifically about your knowledge of the technique." She thought about this. She thought about Cassian's smile and his still eyes, and the particular way she'd felt watching him cross the courtyard. "I'll speak with him if the king requests it," she said. Travar looked at her for a long moment, and then something in his face settled, the way a decision settles. "I'll pass that along," he said. Cassian never sent the request. 3 nights later, she was in the lower archive when she found the passage. She'd gone looking for the original Eastern text, not for any reason she could have explained to someone else, just a pull she'd felt since the conversation with Varen, a need to go back to the source of what she'd read and read it again more carefully. The archive was cold and the candle threw unsteady light, and she almost missed the passage because she'd been looking at a different page. It was in the margin, annotated in a hand older than the main text, in a dialect she had to work through slowly, about the thread, about what the old healers had understood when they used the technique, not poetry, not metaphor, but something they documented and then apparently buried, because it was only in the margin, only in one copy, only here. She sat in the cold for a long time. Then she went to find Dunmar. He was in the guard station at the base of the East Tower. When she told him what she'd found, he didn't look surprised, which told her he already knew something. He sat with his hands flat on his knees and looked at the floor, and then he said, "How much do you know about the White Line?" She knew a little, a bloodline, ancient, that ran in some wolves without expressing, like a fire banked so low it looked like it had gone out. They were mistaken for the wolfless, sometimes for decades. "Maris has always said I'm truly wolfless," Isla said. "Maris was told to say that," Dunmar said, "by your father before he died, to protect you from the people who hunt the White Line." The silence that followed was the kind that restructures things. Isla looked at her hands. Not shaking, she realized. For the first time in as long as she could remember, sitting with the biggest truth of her life, her hands were completely still. She went to the king at first light. He was already awake. She suspected he hadn't slept much because his eyes held that particular quality of a person who had spent the night with things too large to rest beside. He looked at her when she came in and didn't speak, just waited. "I found the original text," she said. "I know." She stopped. "How? Dunmar told me about it this morning." He looked at her steadily. "What it means, the thread, the technique, I knew it might mean that before you did. I just didn't want to tell you something you'd decide about for yourself." Isla stood in the doorway of the room and thought about 3 years of walking the edges of this fortress and eating after everyone else and shrinking herself into corners so she didn't take up space that hadn't been assigned to her. She thought about her hands on the needle in the dark of the healer's chamber, steady enough to hold. She thought about the sound of him breathing wrong in the corridor and the fact that she had turned around. "I don't know how to be anything other than what I've been," she said. "You don't have to know yet," Varen said. "You stayed when you didn't have to. You've been doing that your whole life, I think. Staying when someone needed it, even when no one was going to give you credit for it." He paused. "That's not wolfless. That's just yours." She looked at him. He looked back. Outside, the fortress was waking up. Footsteps, voices, the low bells from the eastern wall calling the morning shift. All the ordinary noise of a place that had never quite made room for her. "Cassian is going to move against you," she said. "I don't have proof yet, but I've watched him and I know." Varen nodded slowly. "I know that too. What are you going to do? What I should have done 3 years ago when you arrived here." He met her eyes. "Make room." The days that followed were not simple. Nothing about the politics of it was clean. Cassian was careful and connected, and the moves against him had to be made with patience, with evidence gathered slowly and hands kept steady through every provocation. Isla was not used to being in the room for any of it. She was used to watching from corridors. Varen kept her in the room. It made some people furious. It made Travar thoughtful in a way that eventually became cautious respect. It made Dunmar quietly satisfied, the look of a man who'd been waiting for a conclusion he'd long suspected. She learned in those weeks that her wolf had not been absent. The White Line didn't announce itself. It lay dormant, conserved, emerged when it was called. And it had been called the night she picked up the needle, the night she turned around in the corridor, the night she cut a length of her own hair and used it to save a man who had the power to ruin her, and instead had only asked her name. The wolf that rose in her was quiet, not the enormous force she'd half expected, having read all those descriptions of first shifts and power and dominance, quieter than that, the way still water is quiet. Not because nothing is moving, but because everything is very, very settled. She shifted for the first time on a cold morning in the eastern courtyard, with Varen watching and Dunmar there with a coat for after. As if he'd known to be ready, she was white. She had not expected to be white. She looked down at her paws and felt something in her chest unlock that she hadn't known was locked, some grief she'd been carrying since she was 9 years old, and the first healer's exam said there was nothing in her, and she believed it. Varen crouched down to eye level. He looked at her for a long time, this wolf that should not have existed, this white wolf, from a line people had been hunting for generations. "Hello?" he said quietly. Like she was someone he'd been waiting to meet. Cassian was dealt with in the way of politics, paper and testimony, and the careful dismantling of alliances built on sand. He never admitted anything, but the proof Isla had helped gather did its work without his admission. He was removed from the succession and sent north, which was the kind of punishment that looked lenient until you spent a winter there. Isla moved out of the small room by the lower corridor. She didn't move because anyone told her to. She moved because one morning she walked past the room that had always been cold and understood, for the first time, that she'd been the one keeping it cold, staying small, staying below notice, staying ready to leave. Old habits from a life lived as someone who wasn't supposed to take up space. She took the room in the east wing that had light in the morning. She planted things in the boxes outside the window, practical things, herbs, the ones she used in the infirmary, and one thing impractical, a small red flower that Maris had always grown on her own window, which had no medicinal value at all, and was just, as far as anyone could tell, beautiful. She was tending it one evening when Varen came to find her. He stood in the doorway the way he'd started doing, not filling it, just present, waiting to be invited rather than simply entering the way he could have. She'd noticed this about him, the particular courtesy of a man who could take up enormous space and chose not to. "The northern settlements want a formal delegation," he said. "I'm sending Travar." "That's good," she said. "I want you to go with him." She turned from the window to look at him. "Why?" "Because you see things Travar doesn't see," he said simply. "Because the packs in the north need to know that the white line is not something to hunt. And because," he paused, and something moved across his face that she'd learned over the past weeks to recognize. The thing he did when he was about to say something he'd actually thought about. "I would like you to know that part of what I'm building is something you helped make." Isla set down the small trowel she'd been using. "I stitched a wound," she said, "with my own hair because there was nothing else. I didn't know what I was doing." "You knew exactly what you were doing," Varen said. "You knew how to keep someone alive. Everything else was already there. It just needed the thread to bind it." She looked at him for a long moment, at the man who had asked her name when he was half dead on a stone table and then remembered it, who had kept her in the room when everyone said she didn't belong there, who crouched in the cold dirt of a courtyard to be eye level with something the world had tried to make her ashamed of. Outside, the small red flower was open in the evening light. She had planted it not knowing if it would survive the cold of these walls. She had planted it anyway. "All right," Isla said. "I'll go."